Welcome to the Stoa. The Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now. And I'll do the same when you're talking. Check-ins. Okay. I feel a primordial calmness right now, and it feels pretty good. Welcome to the Stoa. My name is Peter Lindberg. I'm the steward of the Stoa, and the Stoa is a place for us to cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of this moment. And today is going to be awesome. Today is going to put me at the edge of my thinking, and I will hand it over to our MC of the evening soon, Nicholas Leemacher. Nicholas is sort of like, he's become like the talent scout of the Stoa. He's finding all these like cool people. He's like, hey, Peter, we got to interview this person. We got to talk to this person. And then he introduced me to Carl maybe 2 weeks ago. And I'm like, who the fuck is this guy? This guy's awesome. And then when we had a Zoom chat, I was like, okay, I'm confirmed, really stoked about the session. So I'm going to hand it over to Nicholas now, and he's going to tell us how the session is going to work. And then we're going to hear from the speaker today. So the floor is yours, my friend.
Awesome, thank you. So hey everybody, I'm Nick. I'll be hosting today's Stoa session. And yeah, it's gonna work the same way that they always work. You guys can ask your questions in the chat box. If you want me to read them out, just indicate that. It's gonna be recorded, so just keep that in mind. And yeah, Carl, we have a really special guest that I came across at the Awaken Future Summit a few weeks ago. And yeah, when he presented, I was absolutely mind blown. And I'm really happy that he can now present his work here with the Stoa folks. So yeah, to introduce Carl, I'll just take what's on the website. That's always my best bet. So Carl is director of the Learning Technology Research Center and principal research fellow at Ravensbourne University. He has 16 years experience conducting R&D into the application of hybrid technologies for perceptual and cognitive transformation. He's also the founder of the Cyberdelics Society. So yeah, really exciting stuff. And yeah, let's just hear it from Carl. Carl.
Thanks so much, Nick and Peter. So yeah, I'm going to break the talk down into 6 parts, and we'll go through them pretty rapidly. So I'm going to talk about the origins of the term double consciousness and some definitions of it. Then I'm going to talk about the background into why I'm actually interested in this area and why it's relevant research for today. Then we're going to go into some examples and application areas. Then we're going to counter those application areas with some counter arguments. And then we're going to have some quantifiable benefits and some conclusions. So in terms of a lot of what I'm going to talk about today, I've just published a paper at the British Computer Society, and the paper is called Living in Parallel: Adventures in Double Consciousness and Pluralism. So in terms of the origins of the term, we have Du Bois in 1897 using double consciousness to describe the internal conflict experienced by subordinated groups in an oppressive society. Very apt for these moments. African Americans can experience a double consciousness from being an American and African American at the same time. Aldous Huxley also alluded to double consciousness in 1962 when he states that we have to be oneself and completely something else at the same time, which is the whole secret of life, and the importance of taking regular holidays from the self. I'm particularly interested in Roy Ascott's take on double consciousness in 1999, stated, double consciousness gives access in parallel to 2 distinctly different fields of experience: the shamanic trance, in which the shaman is both in the everyday world and at the same time navigating the outermost limits of other worlds, which is arguably now mirrored by our ability to move through the infinities of cyberspace whilst within the structures of the material world. He goes on, immersion in such noetic simulation may induce real changes of consciousness and eventually real transformations of the self. This techno-shamanism may lead to an evolution of cognition where the subject-object relationship is dissolved and reality begins to be actively constructed rather than passively observed. And ontological design is at the forefront here. So one of the things that made me very interested in these forms of escape is the Hikikomori in Japan, and there's 500,000 of them that have logged out of society. I won a Winston Churchill Fellowship to go to Japan in 2014, and obviously very difficult to study those guys because they're all locked away already, but they're basically saying it's too hard, society's too hard, I'm not going to take part anymore. So how do we try and stop that? And if we think about virtual reality creating these escape routes, Ready Player One scenarios, where people just use the reality that they're in, the physical reality, as a base layer for jumping into the virtual, where you can be whoever you want to be. You're not limited by sex, by how you look, by all the usual physical restraints. But one of the really interesting areas, I think, of double consciousness now is the death shadow that we're all facing. Zach Bush did a brilliant podcast recently where he's talking about the fact that he's working with the dying, and he's working with people that he's bringing back from the death state. And to quote him, let me tell you about what my experience has been in those last moments with patients who are dying. We have the belief in our subconscious, I think because of movies and TV shows we watch, of a big divorce in the death process, which has become sterilized and allowed death to be defined as an endpoint, as a contraction or a disappearance, rather than what I've actually seen it to be, which is a massive expansion of consciousness and awareness. And he talks about people coming back, bringing people back from the dead, and they all ask, why did you bring me back? As if we're kind of like, in a prison in this reality, in the physical realms. And that always strikes me as interesting for the transhumanists who want to prolong life indefinitely. Maybe this is the rehearsal for something else. And a lot of my work is looking at the ancient mystery schools, and that's why I'm so interested in the Stoa, because of all the Greek philosophers went into those mystery schools, into the inner mysteries. 800 years they ran for, and we don't know what exactly went on in there, because initiates were sentenced to death if they spoke about what happened to them in those 3 days. But we know almost certainly that there was a psychedelic involved. We know that there was a rebirth and a death and a rebirth process, much like the Masons go through today. And we know that there was sensory deprivation, etc. So what's interesting is that you enter this liminal space and then you come back changed. I also have my own experiential experience of a life review where I stopped living going forwards, and my entire life was shown to me in reverse. So I lived in these episodic states going backwards. So I was in my normal state of consciousness, but also in my consciousness in those episodic states. And I was able to realize quite quickly that I was able to leave my body in that state, in that double consciousness, and enter a triple consciousness where I could enter anything else. So I went, and the first thing I tried was going into a table and experiencing what it was like to be wood. So I was in the experience of being wood in myself, and in myself a triple consciousness. And then, long story short, I went back 2 years. I was going out with a girl in Berlin. She got pregnant by mistake, and in the time she phones me up, I'm in London, she's in Berlin. She says, I'm pregnant. The abortion's on Tuesday. Slams the phone down. I go over to Berlin. She has the abortion. She takes a pill, so it's very newly pregnant. And I'm aware in my life review that I can go into her body. So I go into her body, and I experience what it's like to be pregnant. I also experience all the anxiety, etc., etc. But then I'm able to choose to go into her womb and experience the abortion at a cellular level. So I'm in a quadruple consciousness, in a parallel consciousness. And for me, this has really changed my perception of what consciousness is, and this idea of consciousness literacy is what I'm talking about here. So if we think about paradox management, that's also something that double consciousness can help, holding two positions at the same time. I mean, if we think about a dead tree in the forest, it's also an ecosystem of new life. So what is that? That is the paradox of this state that we're in. And a great point from Rebel Wisdom Festival recently, David Fuller mentioned that we're in a self-terminating system, but we are also in the best time to be alive. So how can both things be true? And how can we hold those two perspectives without collapsing one into the other? So yeah, we're in a deeply fragile situation right now, but what I'm trying to come up with is solutions, and whether we can gain something from this parallel living. And if we think, so moving on to some examples and application areas, if we think about optical illusions, one of the key attributes or functions of double consciousness, as I've mentioned, is this idea of the ability to expand your perceptual field to give access at one and the same time to two distinctly different fields of experience. And my colleague Kevin Davidson, in the paper I mentioned, he talks about optical illusions. With optical illusions, there's a moment of pleasure when the second perspective comes into focus. It's almost like a little flash of enlightenment as our awareness broadens, like suddenly seeing out of a part of our eyes which we didn't have access to before. Experiences such as these are like medicine for our consciousness, broadening our perceptive bandwidth and leaving us with an awareness that we are agents in constructing our reality. So that's absolutely central to the whole thesis. So I'll talk a little bit about some examples that I wrote about in the paper. So living in virtual reality, we're running a project called Seeing Eye with Mark Farid, where he's going to live through somebody else for a month. We've already launched it at Ars Electronica in Austria, where he lived through 14 different people in 14 days. And so he was so he's wearing virtual reality, but he's not looking into a game environment. He's looking into somebody else's eyes. So somebody else has been wearing a camera, recording their day. And so he's looking through their day and basically not accessing his own hearing or his own sight. And the reason why he originally chose 28 days is because that's how long it takes to form habits. And what he wants to try and do is dissolve his own identity and adopt somebody else's, to see if this idea of, we all know that the self is a construction, a narrative construction. So he's testing that and seeing how much we can dissolve it. And, you know, you've also got loads of examples now in virtual reality. There's one that's quite controversial, which is helping pregnant women with childbirth, so that they're kind of not, you know, this isn't during the birth, this is build up to the birth, during all the pain that they go through. And there's loads of examples where people are like having burns victims, soldiers that have been burnt, that they put on a VR headset so that they're distracted away from the physical and can be taken into the other. And friends of mine that are in chronic pain, you know, we're looking at solutions where they don't focus on their pain, they focus on a visualization of their pain that we place between them and their pain. And they try and change that visualization, which is an accurate rendition of the pain, in order to change the pain. So it's creating these models that show you that reality is a construction. So the second example is this idea of dream hacking. And, you know, we now know that people lucid dream, reliably lucid dream, but the average person gets one lucid dream if they're lucky. I had one lucid dream so far, and I was just there with the calculator, consciously choosing the numbers, and it was like completely retarded. And I hope I get to do another one. But the technology is enabling us now. We know that transcranial stimulation may help put us applied whilst you're in a REM state, may actually produce a lucid dream. If you combine that with some nootropics like galantamine, then you're getting closer to a reliable lucid dream state. And I'm really interested in the fact that, you know, you're in two places at the same time, because you are consciously choosing to change the dream. And, you know, I'll talk a little bit about why that may be problematic, but I think that we know that people that reliably do dream yoga, that they're practicing, say, Tai Chi in a dream state, and they're reporting that it's 4 times more effective in terms of their Tai Chi practice, because they're applying the context as well as doing the activity. They have to apply gravity, for instance. Quite often when you start lucid dreaming, you'll float off the floor because you haven't applied that parameter. And I'm also interested in hypnagogia and hypnopompia, because again, when you're in this, so to explain what those are, this is when you're falling asleep and you enter this liminal space where you may get great ideation, or just when you're waking up. I tend to write tons when I'm sort of half asleep, waking out of a dream, because I'm in between those worlds in this liminal space. And Edison famously had a technology, well, had a technique rather, where he would hold ball bearings over a pan, and as he was falling asleep, he would drop the ball bearings, and then that would wake him up, and he would write down the ideas that he would access in that space. So the third example is this one of DMT extended technology. So I've been lucky enough to be part of the Imperial studies where they're injecting me with pure DMT and scanning my brain in an fMRI scanner. I don't recommend it, although it was one of the most profound experiences of my life. I'm not going to go into that, that's in other talks, but the DMT extended experience is when you can be kept on a drip and fed DMT and kept in that realm, you know, maybe for 40 minutes, then for 4 hours, then for, you know, 4 days. So, you know, the idea from Gallimore is that he's looking at using the third dimension to launch into hyperspace permanently, where your body is kept in a, you know, in a pod, and waste management is taking care of all of your bodily needs, etc. So you're fed food, etc. The reason why I'm interested in it, even though I think it's quite problematic from a double consciousness point of view, is that whenever I take DMT, I see this language at the core of my vision, which is persistent, and it's you know, it's ancient and modern at the same time. It's these hieroglyphs, and if I'm in a DMT extended state, I could potentially sit there and draw it and bring back something from this dream state. A lot of, you know, all of us struggle to remember our dreams. As soon as I need a wee in the morning, that's it. As soon as that process is happening, my dream is rapidly disappearing. So I love to bring things back from dream states, and there's arguments, especially out of Chris Timmerman's research, that DMT, in terms of brain signature, is very similar to a dreaming state. And then another example would be, so just to finish on that, so a DMT extended experience, or a DMT experience even, you know, if your body is kept in a pod, you're not really aware of the body, you know, so you're not really in a double consciousness, you're just in hyperspace. And a more authentic example of double consciousness, you could argue, is something that I learned from a brilliant podcast by Lauren Fields with Andy Letcher, where he's talking about the difference between cordyceps and the general synergistic value of mushrooms, magic mushrooms. So cordyceps is when an ant is infected by this mushroom, cordyceps, and the ant carries on as normal, doesn't really know it's been infected, and it's literally the mushroom is infected its muscles, it's around its brain, and when the mushroom decides it wants to reproduce, it triggers the ant into this remote controlled state where it climbs to the tallest tree it can find, it chomps down on the specific leaf at a specific angle, and it basically then needs to, you know, the body of the ant is dissolved. And then mushrooms come out of the body of the ant, and spores come out of the mushroom, spreading to all the ants beneath. So, you know, again, not really a double consciousness, even though you could argue that the ant and the mushroom are cohabiting the same space at a certain time, but it's more of a zombification of the ant. Whereas if you think about the psilocybin containing mushrooms, we know that there are 200 plus mushrooms. We found that out. We found out how to, you know, prepare those mushrooms to take ourselves. So we're spreading the mushrooms across the world. We are in the service of the mushroom, but in return, the mushroom, as we ingest it, is allowing our consciousness to see the world in a more mushroomy way. And I think that is a much more likely, you know, version of double consciousness, where both parts of the equation are being nourished at the same time. So, you know, this idea of, you know, the human and the non-human, I think if we're going to really learn, we need to learn from something more intelligent than us. And you could argue that is the mycelium. The mushroom has survived 5 mass extinctions, and we're causing the 6th. So the fact that the mushroom is, you know, allowing us to, or rather the mushroom shares when it's in abundance. So, you know, we can learn from that. If we don't, then we're not going to survive. So looking at that sort of thing, but also, you know, Umwelt hacking, which is when you actually hack at the sensorial system of another creature. Brilliant examples from Marshmallow Laserfish, excuse me, a great VR outfit where you're able to experience, you know, different species through VR. But a brilliant example from the paper is the one from Stephen Harding, where in his short film Encountering Another Being, he talks about the monk jack and experiencing the monk jack's consciousness. I could immediately understand the wholeness of the monk jack and how they relate to the entire wood. And it went further than that. I could also get a sense of the ecology of the whole forest. It suddenly came into focus through the being of the monk jack. The whole came into my perception. And then if I was very lucky, that wholeness would spread out, and I'd get a sense of the ecology of the entire earth. So, you know, what's fascinating about that is his interaction enables him to multiply and amplify the experience in order to apply it to the entire environment. So moving from content engineering to context engineering. And then the final sort of example from my own experience is one of journaling. And for me, I've written a diary for 30 years. I've written it from 3 different levels. So I write content, what I've done, context, how I felt, and concepts, what I've thought. It's 5 minutes a day. It's incredibly easy to do if you just get into the habit of doing it. And the benefits are marvelous because you're forced to live. You can't keep getting you can't write the same material down every day. So you have to get new material every day. You know, you can read a relationship in an afternoon, say that, you know, been in a relationship for a year, it's on 50, 60 pages. You can read all that in an afternoon. You get a map, you get a bird's eye view of the whole relationship. And then what I do is I take cross sections through that database, and I'm seeing my life, you know, in 30 different me's. So I look at this day last year and the year before and the year before and the year before and the year before, and I create this plurality. I'm able to, you know, get those 30 me's communicating again. And I'm also able to understand what it is useful to do in retrospect, because I've kept this ability to jump out of the point of view and go into the field of view. So I'm literally creating this double consciousness around my own life. And that ability to see in the overview, getting the overview effect, is amazing. And a brilliant point raised again at the Rebel Wisdom Festival was one Nora Bateson mentioned, which is, where can you go to find, the question was, where can you go to find sources of wisdom? And her answer was, I get wisdom from everywhere. And therefore it's like, for me, you know, it's like this idea, wisdom is gained by taking a higher order perspective on your own perspective. So I'm mining my own life to create my own wisdom. This tool allows me to relive past experiences, but from an alternate perspective, from the person I am now, to go back to those decisions, to try and learn why I made those decisions, granting me a greater in-depth understanding where I become wiser, but only if I've been honest with myself, and I'm still honest with myself. So counter-arguments. Huxley, as my colleague Rhiannon Crane mentioned, that, you know, in his Doors of Perception, he argues, you know, we've got to make the best of all worlds. But in his final years, he spent time warning people about the dangers of escaping into a nirvana apart from the world. And if we think about the living in VR example, you know, living inside somebody else can again be aligned with escapism. And you know, the whole VR is pain relief thing, great when it's applied to the soldiers that are having their burns replaced, but their dressings replaced, but not so great if you're trying to maintain a natural experience of birth. And DMTx, the counter argument there is, you know, Jack Charles Aloka states, there is a danger that the psychedelic state is being over romanticized. DMT extended could be argued to be a new form of biochemical VR, where we are getting stuck into another Game of Thrones that is not on the screen, but inside our own minds. We have to rise above everything being reduced to entertainment. Otherwise, we will become junkies of altered states that don't go anywhere. So the counter to that counter is the idea that if we are plugging into an orthogonal reality rather than a dream state, then we're actually exploring other realms. We'll come back to that. And then the final one, the dream hacking one, you know, do we really want to spend our times, you know, in lucid dream states doing more work? You know, I'm actually like worried that if I do have reliable dream states, I will just read all the papers that I don't get time to read in normal life. So I'll scan them before bed and then I'll read them in my dream state. So everything becomes work. And also, you know, some of my friends that are actually dreaming at length, they spend all their days writing those dreams down. So they're not really in a nested ecology. They're just in this sort of escapist world. So moving on to the benefits, quantifiable benefits. I think the conscious state shifting, if we describe state shifting as recognition of what state you're in and the ability to observe versus blend with states, or the ability to surrender to challenging states and the ability to also shift states at will. So moving from the thinker to the observer of the thinker is fantastic, and moving the observer around. Heather Hargreaves doing some amazing work in state shifting. And if you think about this idea of perceptual flexibility through perspective shifting, going back to Nora Bateson's argument about getting wisdom from everywhere, and one of the audience members said, so what is the feeling of that? What is the mechanism by which you can tune into the relationships between all of the different places where you might get wisdom from? So much of the time, it's about noticing the pull of one thing or another to one story or narrative, or to one way of thinking or another, and resisting the pull and staying in that liminal space in between the two poles and seeing how long you can hold that space and noticing what happens in that bridge that you have built. So again, going back to the hypnopompic, hypnagogic stuff where you're in between worlds. And this also relates to John Vervaeke's stuff around relevance realization and salience landscaping, which I won't have time to go into. So other forms of perceptual flexibility, like I mentioned, this idea of holding paradox, the ability to be inside a lucid dream practicing Tai Chi or Qigong or whatever it is you want to practice. Cognitive diversity is another benefit, and brilliant work by Mel Slater, where he's putting people in VR into a drummer's body, for instance, so they can practice drummer. So they're in a famous sort of drummer's body and their drumming improves because they're inside the body of a famous drummer. So it's this, all of this sort of stuff, and he does brilliant work around race and prisoners and all the rest of it. And I think the sixth benefit is this idea of reimagining the imagination, or encouraging the use of imagination. And a lot of what I'm talking about is about the imagination, of course. And Kevin Davidson again states, I think this is fundamental to child development. We talk about the Waldorf schools as schooling the imagination. It's ever more important when children are having a lot of their imagination done for them, and they have less opportunity to be bored with nothing to do, i.e. no sensory input coming at them. Watching Disney films is like toxic white sugar for the imagination. You've planted a seed for something about what the driving edge of VR can teach, you know, how we prepare children for the future. So it's all for me about not replacing imagination with computer animation, not being prescriptive, creating worlds that are declarative, that are maps that you can walk around without being told where to go. So to conclude, obviously the problem with double consciousness is that it implies a polarity, it implies dualism, and consciousness itself is obviously infinite to us, although we may just spend all of our times in the reception room of our minds rather than in the infinity of our potential, which is what I'm hoping to unlock this human potential, rather than the human downgrading that what we're doing with current technologies with these tiny little screens and small real estate. So different umwelts demonstrate there are many manifestations of consciousness. There are as many manifestations of consciousness as there are beings, all coexisting in the universe and the multiverse. So pluralism represents multiple ways of knowing. So, you know, moving from double consciousness to pluralism, pluralism is about multiple ways of knowing, or multiple ontologies, unity in diversity. And, you know, I think that a lot of what we're seeing is this idea of dealing with otherness, holding on to, with this integral view, holding on to multiplicity, hybridity, the I, we, it model. And brilliant quote from Eric Davis, there is something about the interpersonal, there is something about the other. One of the problems with the non-dual vision of unity is that it dissolves the radical claim of the other, the outside, and the beyond. As we become post-human and we wake up to the fact that we are absolutely embedded in these non-human forces, systems, and relationships, instead of emphasizing unity, we should be focusing on pluralism. The actual nature of reality is multiple. And Grant Morrison, I think, who will be a future guest on the STOA, he talks about this idea of the ecology of selves. Are we going to stick to these personalities, these bounded territorial things, or are we going to expand ourselves into something bigger? The first thing you have to change is yourself. This can be achieved through understanding your dark side, for instance. Let us become plex creatures so we're able to take on new personality traits and able to extend our boundaries into what was previously the enemy territory. And yeah, this is an essential practice to demonstrate to ourselves that we are co-creating our reality. And if you think about an ecology of practices, wisdom is found by cultivating an ecology of practices, whether it's mindful inquiry, biological inquiry, mimetic inquiry. And again, Nora Bates' brilliant session on warm data at Rebel Wisdom, she talked about triple contexting, asking the same questions through 3 contexts at the same time. Again, living in parallel. And a lot of what I've talked about, just to finish, is language. I'm talking about metaphors. I'm talking about living in 2 places at the same time. I'm talking about multiple scales. So I need to look now at how much of language is impacting on my thinking. But also I want to build a typology, a taxonomy of these different types of double consciousness and moving on to the pluralist stuff. But what I hope I've shown you is that it's not about building new realms of augmented escapism, but building new forms of consciousness literacy. And if we can increase plurality, we can increase tolerance. Please feel free to message me if you want a paper. Thank you.
Wow. I feel very excited, very very alive after hearing that, because there's so many thoughts, so many ideas that just come rushing in, and it's fascinating work that you're doing. So the first thing I wanted to say is that I really enjoyed that you didn't use slides this time around, because the last time I listened to you, you did use slides, and there's a lot of insane, beautiful content that you use there. So for all the people listening on YouTube, there's quite a few presentations where Carl presents some of these ideas using some of the slides that emphasize the content. So I highly recommend checking that out. And so there are quite a few cool questions in the chat box. But before we go there, I had a question, but I'm thinking of how to rephrase it after this presentation. One thing I've been thinking a lot about is, I think it comes from Alexander Bard, where he says something like, the machines are going to be the best at being the machines, right? They're going to be absolutely great, AI, all that. So we as humans should be the best humans that we can be, right? So that we can later develop some sort of symbiotic intelligence between these two. And then he uses logos to talk about the machine, and pathos to talk about the human, and then to find a shared mythos between those two. And so I guess a question in that regard would be that it seems like you're expanding what it means to be human in some ways, and what we're able to do as humans. So you call it hyperhumanism. So maybe if you could riff a bit on hyperhumanism, and perhaps also share what your thoughts are on where this narrative will come from, right? I mean, we can have these practices that will inform the things that we do, but don't you sense that we need some sort of narrative to inform our actions in the future?
Yeah. So the hyperhumanist stuff is a counter to the transhumanist agenda. So I did a keynote with Ray Kurzweil last year in Melbourne, Creative Innovation. And we were framing around intelligence 2.0, like where do we go with this stuff? And you know, if we look at the transhumanists, they're trying to prolong life, potentially indefinitely, although Ray was unwell at the time and started to sort of talk about maybe prolong life, a certain quality of life rather than indefinite extension. And also they're very much dependent on technology. And what I'm trying to do with my work is find those opportunities where we can use a technology to kickstart an ability that we may already have in our analog world. And our analog world is being robbed. We're being robbed of our analog abilities because of poorly designed technologies. And you know, I'm always quoting this example from Cyborgness, because I work with them on their new sense called North Sense, which is about to be updated. So all it is a little chip that you wear, and their tagline is a transhumanist one. They say we don't want to wear technology, we want to become it. And I think that's problematic, primarily because, you know, we may have already had the North Sense and lost it because of the use of technology. And I think technology atrophies muscles that we actually have anyway. You know, an example is one of my friends, you know, he doesn't use the internet until he absolutely needs to, because it's a giant brain and he wants to actually find things out for himself. So of course that can't be often the case. But to go back to Cyborgness, I think the general idea is that, yeah, it vibrates every time you face north. After a few weeks, you've got that as a new sense. You know, it's like, but also there's an example from a different device called Feel Space, which is where you wear a belt. It's got vibration motors in it. It vibrates every time you face north in exactly the same way. But the difference is that you take that off. With the Cyborgness version, you leave it on and it's permanently attached to you. The Feel Space belt, you take off after 6 to 8 weeks and you still have that new sense. So I'm really interested in, like, you know, imagine the stabilizers on your bike, you remove the stabilizers and you have the new skill of cycling. So that's how I see technology, and that's Hyperhumanism's unlocking your innate human abilities or human potential that you didn't know you have, and maybe just using technology as a catalyst to get there. Can you remind me of the second part of the question?
It's more about the narrative about how we should be using this. So how do we inform, I guess, the ethos? Like, what is the, I mean, it sounds amazing, all the things that you're doing, and it's like very experimental in some ways, right? But is there any sense of ethics that you rely on, I guess, in some sense?
Well, I think that's why I'm so fascinated by creating frameworks of use around these things. And I think a lot of the time it's a literacy thing. I mean, we're currently working on a death literacy project because I think we're all in the death shadow at the moment. And I think it's, you know, it's all around education, like the same with psychedelics, you know, that there's certain frameworks of use around set and setting, and understanding that, you know, set and setting are just as important as the actual substance. Same with technology, the hyperhumanist approach. I think that people aren't aware of it, and they're losing their, you know, we give up so much agency to the technologies, that we lose the fact that we are the ultimate technology, you know. And that's it for me. It's all about, you know, how do we get there with our own stuff, and how do we educate ourselves? And I think that a lot of the technologies are being co-opted. The agendas of the corporations they're not looking out for us. So I think it's about DIY approaches. It's about getting good news stories out there around technology. Tristan Harris at the Center for Humane Technology is doing a fantastic job. Very succinctly puts into a single 2-page PDF how they're basically achieving this human downgrading and what we can do about it.
Awesome. Well, I mean, there's so many questions I would want to follow up with, but there's maybe Gray had a really nice question.
Mm-hmm.
I think, can everybody unmute themselves?
Yeah, I'm good. Thanks, Nick. Oh. my question was, I hear this tension in these kind of like technological realms between the opportunities we have to explore and the temptations we may have to escape. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit on how we can like tell in our bodies the difference between those two impulses in ourselves so that we can try to develop a sensitivity and make better decisions.
Yeah, it's a good one, isn't it? I think you're right, because we're so, I mean, again, my friend Jack Alocker's talking about young people, how they're very much used to this low-level stimulation all the time. So they're kind of like, they're not getting bored. They're not feeling into the fact that these technologies are you know, just, they're not your friend a lot of the time. And it's about disengaging a lot of the time. I mean, there's a brilliant example where my friend Hannah Close was talking about, I posted this article about Buddhism and the Oculus Rift, and how the Oculus will transform Buddhism. And her argument was, it doesn't need to be augmented. It's already, you know, something that's been practiced for millennia. And, you know, but, you know, you could argue that same thing, that the Buddhist, you know, may have said the same thing about Buddhism to the Buddha. I mean, it's like, I think that it's about having cognitive sovereignty. You know, you need to be able to disengage, to spend time away from the gadgets, to realize that, you know, your ability to explore your consciousness is your birthright. And the information overload, this ability to disengage and turn down the volume of the thinker, the brain, the constant brain chatter, like, you know, it's always like, you're rubbish, you're rubbish, you're rubbish. So it's having holidays from the self, but having them in a as healthy a way as you can, not just going into the escapist realms, which are so prevalent. And I think again, it's literacy around escapism that we need to generate. Thank you for the question.
And then maybe a good follow-up question would be Peter. Peter's question.
Thank you, Nick. It might have already been asked. I'll just, or answered, I should say, but I'll ask it again in the frame that I worded it in. Okay, so once you have access to this ecology of states, and you have the capacity for ontological diversity, how do you determine what state to access? Like, how do you kind of like navigate them? And it's like, what to maybe's question, if we're not going to be consumers of consciousness, then what are we going to be, like explorers? Or is there something more to be than just an explorer?
Yeah, I mean, it's practice. It's absolutely practice. And it comes back to the state shifting thing. You know, if you're having these feedback loops that neurofeedback creates, this ability to, you know, much like the quantified self idea, that you're accessing these realms of the inner machinery. And I think it's a brilliant question, Peter, because it's so alien to us that we have all these inner realms. And yeah, I think it's practice. It's ultimately literacy. It's about knowing that you can do these things. I mean, I've just signed up for the Finders course, which is 1,000 different types of meditation. And, you know, it's pick a mix, kind of 17-week course. And Josh Fields actually recommended it to me, because one of my big projects is this idea of how do we do, I mean, what I've learned from the Cyberdelics Society with Jose is that it's very niche, you know, trying to create altered states with technology. It's quite a niche area. But what isn't niche is the fact that we have 1,000 different types of meditation. We have 1,000 different types of breathing. We have 1,000 different types of dance. So how can we put all of those things? How can we create stacks? As in, like Jamie Wheal talks a lot about these ideas. We've got the breath work, we've got the meditation, we've got all these things that are already there. And it's around practicing like different breathing techniques to see what ontological state it results in. And obviously we have cultural differences and gender differences and everything else. So it's citizen science actually approach that we need to create. It's you know, it's this ability to start with some meditation, do some breath work, go into VR experience, come out of the VR experience, maybe take a microdose, do some more breath work. You know, it's endless. It's endless. And that's why frameworks are so important.
I have a follow-up question. Regarding the framework too, like, so I'm reminded of my culture war analysis, where there's like an ecology of meme plexes out there in the noosphere. And the idea is, once you have an intimacy with them, not only on a propositional level, but on a felt sense level, you can get into right relationship from them and then get the signal, get the truth without getting triggered or hijacked by their sort of egoic machinations. And I'm seeing sort of a similar project where there's an ecology of different ontological states. And then one of the first moves is just to be an explorer there, so you can get into a right relationship with it. And then you can know when to turn it on, when you need to turn it on. Is that sort of the right read?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it's that holistic approach and that's why I love all the rebel wisdom stuff and the sense making and the meaning crisis, because it's all about feeling. We've been thinking ourselves to death. And I think that combining your intuition with your cognition is absolutely what we need to be doing, because we're just carrying our heads around in our bodies and not really doing the body work. And I think as soon as you're sitting down and you're staring in front of a screen, your whole creative apparatus is switched off. You need to be in movement. And that's why I'm really interested in the mixed reality technologies, where we can do away with this constant sitting and actually be in the world still, and actually, you know, have our movement to actually create these holistic creative ways of being.
Cool.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Peter.
A nice follow-up would be Brandon's question.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thanks, Carl. This has been fascinating. Yeah, my question is just, what is the relationship between double consciousness and empathic capacity? It seems like there's a lot of overlap, for me at least.
Say that again.
Empathic capacity, being an empath.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, you know, empathy is, I mean, people talked about virtual reality as an empathy engine in the early days, and I think that's been pretty discredited now. And for me, it's about compassion. There's a book, I can't remember the author, Against Empathy, because, you know, a lot of the time, if you're empathizing with somebody without the compassion, it's kind of it can be destabilizing, and you can actually be in the same state and not able to help them if you're you know, without the compassion. So for me, absolutely, you know, if we're prisoners of our own selves, and I think anything that enables us to have the felt experience of another, you know, and I'm super interested in you know, all the different techniques around sense making others, but also disassociatives and the ability to dissolve the self and actually enter you know, possession. You know, being possessed is such a fascinating realm. And yeah, I think it's a fantastic question, and I'd love to have a follow-up with you, Brandon, on that.
If I can just add, yeah, I'm just curious, like, those who claim to be empaths, do you feel that they are experiencing some double consciousness state, or is there something different happening here?
Yeah, I mean, it's I'm always trying to counter the whole double consciousness thing as well as promote it. I think, and Camille's asked a brilliant question around DMT and my DMT experiences. I think the most profound thing that DMT's taught me is that absolutely telepathy is real. And you know, when I was having my brain scanned in the scanner, in the fMRI scanner, it was very incredible, because the amount of entities that turned up en masse, all different varieties, all saying to me, what the hell's happening to you? You know, because obviously I'm in a scanner and the setting is completely transformed. And the benevolence of these creatures, all like, just like wanting to help and you know, sort of telepathically sort of showing me visually that I'm immortal, but currently in a human body, and basically saying, don't die, whatever you do. And I spent the entire like 40 minutes in that scanner trying to calm them down, which is a very interesting, you know, double consciousness. And you know, I really, you know, telepathy is real depending on, you know, the way you're viewing things, and what you're viewing through. And you know, totally agree.
Awesome. And then Rain, you have 2 questions, so I like both of them. So whichever one feels more alive to you, I guess.
Thanks. This is fascinating. Thank you so much for being here. My question is about these the plurality consciousness, maybe double consciousness. I don't know quite the distinctions, but the plurality consciousness. Do you see that from an integral perspective as a higher stage or a state or some combination?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's where we're headed if we're lucky to live long enough. And you know, I've had these transformative experiences where I've gone into a realm or a dimension which I would class as a 5th dimensional realm, where I'm aware of everyone's thoughts. There's no longer any privacy. It's, you know, everything and everyone knows everything about you. It's kind of, it's just done, you know. I've also, you know, had experiences of, you know, I only ever had one reading in my life, but the guy was like, you know, when you've completed your mission on Earth, you get all of your lives back. You know, much like I'm doing with my diary, I have this ability to unlock 30 different me's because I'm daily going through these cross sections and turning my life itself into architecture, these parallel worlds where I'm creating that muscle. I'm creating that pluralistic way of seeing, where I'm not just in the point of view. Everyone goes on about, you know, it's all about being in the moment. I would argue absolutely, but also be all of those selves at the same time. And you know, and it doesn't take much to actually access that plurality. It's just a practice. It's something that you need to build up. And yeah, for me, I've focused on the double consciousness, but I want to write a whole paper around what you've just asked.
Maybe I can still ask a quick question. So like, what came up is, okay, so these are they sometimes lasting effects, or how long do they last? Because it is a practice, and you're like training a muscle, and the stronger the muscle, I guess the longer the effects last. But sometimes, I guess, depending on, yeah, whichever of the many experiences you've participated in, are there some that had a longer lasting effect than others?
Yeah, I mean, I had an out-of-body experience at 27, and that for me was the beginning of all of this journey, because I was basically, you know, I got completely sober. I walked into an empty room and went out body standing up, and went into a realm where I was, you know, felt like I was headed upwards, and I was suddenly this ginormous beam of light, like imagine a javelin of light. And I was rotating in a wheel of light of these beams, and suddenly I could see 8 other beams of light. And a disembodied voice tells me, your soul is inhabiting 8 other bodies, and you're only aware of one. And the voice also says, look up, because this wheel of light is only part of what you're in. And before I could look up, my friend who's downstairs, basically, he was calling my name. And as he was calling my name, I was pulled out of this space and poured back into my body. And as I was being poured back in, I was told, you're not Carl, you're having the experience of being Carl for 1,000 months. And the second thing, there is no death. And the third thing was, tell everybody. And from that, you know, that permission almost, you know, because again, no drugs involved, completely, and I was standing up, you know, it was completely wild. And I'd never tried DMT. It took me 10 years to find it after that. And even then, nothing like DMT. So completely wild. And you know, I found a book called the Knowledge Book, Gnosis book, and it was basically a diagram in this book that looked exactly like what I had experienced, and the figure was called the programming station of awe. So I still haven't fully understood, but what then that led me to, and I've never practiced out of body experiences since. That was a completely like a gift. And what was super interesting was that when I had my life review at 40, was this ability to leave my body inside that space. And maybe I would never have even thought of doing that or felt that I could do that without having the out of body experience previous. So super interesting when we start to use our transformative experiences as material for our own development, and actually using those as much as I do, because, you know, I'm a computer scientist, but I also like to talk about these experiences because so much of what, you know, so much of people, you know, people don't talk about them. And I think that it's absolutely vital that we consider these felt experiences as just as important as anything cognitively.
Okay, we're nearing the end of the session, but perhaps we can still squeeze in one more question. What do you think, Cara?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right, Key, could you unmute yourself?
Why going live? It's okay. Thank you so much, Carl, for the entire presentation. I've made like so many notes, and I'm very thankful to be able to create these notes in the first place. So my question, I'll just read it from here because I was curious as to why you put it in the words that you did. Could you clarify your use of the term dark side and death literacy? And I'm really appreciative of you saying that, oh, like well, what you've said. And how you said it was the extend our boundaries into what was previously an enemy territory while focusing on like changing and improving ourselves. And I realize it's a little bit of a vague question, but thank you. You're mute? Are you on mute?
Charles, you're on mute.
Yes, sorry. Yeah, I was actually quite, I mean, part of that was the death literacy thing was, yeah, I think that if we, around the mystery schools and this whole thing about, you know, going through a death experience, much like what we are. I mean, you know, I've definitely been through the dark night of the soul over the last 3 months. And I think it's so refreshing and vital to basically face your mortality. I mean, I know friends of mine that will believe they're immortal. You know, at a certain age, you just do. You just don't get it. And so they go and work in nursing homes in order to get that death literacy and to, you know, to try and counter this feeling of immortality and endless time. And I think the reason why the mystery schools and these initiations are so important is because you get on with what's really important in your life. You know, you don't mess around anymore. You stop acting like, and I do believe we are immortal, but not in these bodies. So I think that get on with your mission, whatever it is. If your mission is just to play, then get on with that. But the point is yeah, having an awareness. And the bit about the dark side and all that, that wasn't me. That was Grant Morrison. Yeah, where he's talking about basically becoming, you know, treat your friends close and your enemies closer. So, you know, it's all material. We're in this non-duality, but we're also in a multiverse of infinite consciousnesses. And for me, it's all about consciousness literacy. So thank you for the question.
All right. Wow. Well, that was a fantastic session. I mean, everybody's like in awe, I think, of all the amazing things you've shared. So maybe you could share where we can find more of your stuff online.
Yeah, sure. I'll just put my email in the chat, and then people can email me for any links, and I can send you the paper and links to talks. Breaking convention, I've got like 3 talks over the last few years. And yeah, I'd love to keep in touch with the Stoa. Big fans of you guys. I think you're doing a fantastic job, Peter, with amazing guests. And yeah, I'd love to do this again.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on the Stoa. And I don't know if Peter you wanna say something?
Yeah, I'll do some final thoughts. Carl, thanks so much. We'd love to, I consider you part of the Stoa village now. So you're part of the family. Feel free to come back anytime if you have any ideas you'd like to chat, or I think Tyson said you should come back for some kind of reality hacking psychotech. Love to see that if you can conjure up something there.
Sure.
Nick, thank you for emceeing again today. And maybe, are you still there? Do you want to maybe chat about the session we're having in an hour?
Yeah, in an hour, we're going to have a session, and Jeremy, I'm going to look up his name. Sorry, I did not expect to be doing this shout out. Give me 1 second. We're all practicing our stoicism here at the Stoa.
Jeremy Johnson, I didn't mean to.
Oh, look at, he's helping me. That's so great. Jeremy Johnson's going to be talking about liminality and how that's sort of like the essential underlying emotional current to the whole meta crisis that we're dealing with now. He's, you know, going to be grounded in some like integral philosophy and stuff like that. He's a really, really chill, cool guy. He is just fun to sit and be in the presence of. So that's going on at noon. Eastern time. If you guys want to drop by, I think that you will really enjoy his company.
Yeah, and thank you, maybe. And he just launched a new platform called Liminal News, which is pretty cool. I recommend checking it out. And then Eric Davis, who Carl mentioned, he's coming in next week, The High Weirdness of COVID. That's June 10th at 4 p.m. Eastern time. So check that out as well. All right, everyone. Thanks so much. See you soon.